What if the school bully picked on the wrong girl? A quiet new kid with a secret so powerful it could bring down his entire reign. Welcome to Clearview High in Houston, Texas, where Maya Williams, a 16-year-old with more grit than she lets on, steps into a battlefield of lockers and Letterman jackets. Bryce Carter, the untouchable quarterback king, thinks she's an easy target, until he crosses a line he didn't see coming. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a masterclass in patience, smarts, and a twist that'll leave you speechless. From a trash locker to a showdown that shakes the school, watch as Maya turns the tables in ways you won't predict. Stick with us till the end, because what starts with a bully's arrogance ends with his epic downfall, and a lesson about the quiet ones you should never underestimate. If you love underdog stories with a punch, hit that like button, subscribe for more epic tales, and drop a comment. Tell us who you think will win this fight. Let's dive in. The Houston sun didn't know when to quit, even in October, searing the asphalt of Clearview High School's parking lot until it shimmered like molten glass. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and exhaust, a stubborn Texas heat that mocked the faint crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. Beyond the school's red brick sprawl, the football field lay like a faded green crown, waiting for Friday night lights to turn sweaty kids into legends. Inside, the hallways pulsed with raw energy. Sneakers squealed on scratched tiles, lockers crashed shut, and the greasy tang of cafeteria burgers hung like a fog. Clearview was a suburban jungle, loud, predictable, and carved up by an invisible food chain. Everyone knew their rank, everyone except Maya Williams. She stepped off the creaky school bus that Monday morning, her worn sneakers hitting the pavement with a soft thud. 16 and small, barely 5 feet, with tight braids swinging against her shoulders, Maya didn't look like much. Her dark skin glowed under the sun, and her faded gray backpack sagged as she shifted its weight. To the kids streaming past in their varsity jackets and overpriced kicks, she was just another face, another nobody. But her eyes, sharp, brown, and cutting, swept the chaos of Clearview High like a hunter clocking her turf, sorting the loud from the dangerous. Maya wasn't here to shine. 3 schools in 3 years had drilled the rules into her. Head low, locker located, lunch spot claimed, trouble dodged. Her family had washed up in Houston chasing what her mom called a new chapter. But Maya wasn't fooled. New chapters didn't erase old ink. They just gave you fresh pages to bleed on. She yanked her hoodie tighter, squared her slim shoulders, and wove through the crowd toward the front doors, sidestepping elbows and laughter that rang too sharp. Inside, the school was a furnace of noise, shouts ricocheting off cinder block walls, a teacher's voice barking over the din, the hard slam of a locker echoing down the hall. Maya clutched her wrinkled schedule like a lifeline, her boots scuffing the tile as she pressed forward. She'd almost reached her first class when she saw him. Bryce Carter leaned against a row of lockers like he'd poured the concrete himself, and to most of these kids he might as well have. 6 feet of quarterback bulk, blonde hair buzzed short on the sides, and a smirk that screamed he owned the world. His red varsity jacket draped over broad shoulders, and the knot of guys around him. Letterman patches, flexed biceps, and too much Axe body spray. Laughed too loud at whatever he'd just said. Bryce was the golden boy. Rich parents, a souped-up truck in the lot, and a rep that made him bulletproof. But Maya caught the strain in his stance, the way he held his chin high, shoulders stiff. He wasn't just sure of himself. He needed everyone else to be sure too. She didn't mean to ping his radar. She was just slipping past, eyes down, when some slab of a kid in his crew, probably a linebacker, slammed her shoulder. Hard. Her books hit the floor with a flat smack, pages fanning out across the tiles like spilled secrets. Snickers rippled through the hall, head swiveling to stare. Maya bit back a curse, dropping to her knees to scrape them up, heat creeping up her neck despite the steel in her spine. Well, what's this? The voice was smooth, lazy, but cut like a blade. She didn't need to look up to know it was Bryce. His shadow loomed over her, wide and heavy, while his buddies chuckled like it was their job. New girl's already dropping stuff. Maya's fingers clenched around her history book, her pulse thumping in her ears. She could feel the hallway stall, eyes pinning her like a target. She stood, slow and steady, brushing past him without a word, her jaw tight. Don't bite, she told herself. Guys like him thrive on the fight. Starve him out. But Bryce wasn't the type to drop it. Hey, I'm talking to you, he called louder now, his voice slicing through the chatter. No manners, huh? She kept walking, the back of her neck prickling as the crowd parted. Then she felt it, a quick, sharp tug on her backpack, yanking her back a step. Her breath hitched, and she turned, slow as a loaded spring, to face him. Bryce stood there, arms crossed, that smirk still plastered on his face. Up close, he towered over her, blue eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and a dare. You deaf or just slow? He said, tilting his head. His crew laughed again, right on cue. The hallway went silent to her, nothing but the thud of her own heartbeat and the weight of a dozen stares. She met his gaze unblinking and said low and firm, You shouldn't have done that. Bryce blinked, caught off guard, then let out a slow, mocking laugh. And why's that, princess? Maya didn't answer. She just stared, letting the silence stretch, thick and pointed. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe a nick of doubt. He didn't know it yet, but he just lit a fuse. She turned and walked off, her steps soft against the tile, leaving Bryce with his smirk fading and his buddies shifting awkwardly. The bell shrieked overhead, snapping the tension, and kids scattered to class. But Maya knew this wasn't over. Guys like Bryce didn't let a nobody walk away clean. She was right. By the time the last bell rang, the Houston sky was bleeding orange, shadows stretching long across the parking lot. Maya slung her backpack over one shoulder and headed for the curb, replaying that hallway moment in her head. She'd seen his kind before, bullies who built their castles on other people's backs. She wasn't about to bend. Hey, new girl. His voice cut through the drone of engines and chatter. She turned, and there he was, leaning against his black truck, hands in his pockets, grin back like it had never slipped. A couple of his goons lounged nearby, watching with lazy smirks. Maya sighed, planting her feet. What do you want? Bryce stepped closer, slow and deliberate. You got some nerve. Think you're better than me? She let out a short, dry laugh. Not scared, just done. It threw him, and she saw it in the twitch of his jaw. No, she said, stepping just close enough to make him pause. I just think you should walk away. He chuckled, shaking his head. And why's that? Maya leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. Because you don't know who you're messing with. Before he could snap back, a low rumble rolled through the lot, a deep, guttural hum that turned heads. A sleek black Escalade pulled up, its polished curves gleaming under the fading sun, tinted windows swallowing the light. The driver's window slid down, and there he was, Marcus Kane, all broad shoulders and quiet steel, his dark skin catching the glow, one hand resting on the wheel, eyes locking onto Bryce like a storm rolling in. Bryce's smirk vanished like spit on a hot skillet. Maya adjusted her backpack, a tight, knowing smile curling her lips. Still want to keep this up? She asked. He didn't answer. For once, Bryce Carter was mute. The Escalade's engine purred as Maya walked past him, yanked the passenger door open, and slid inside. The door thudded shut, and as they pulled away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The king of Clearview High had just stepped into a fight he couldn't win, and he didn't even know the half of it yet. The Escalade's tires hummed against the Houston asphalt as it cut through the late afternoon, the city blurring past in streaks of concrete and glass. Inside, the leather seats creaked faintly as Maya shifted, letting her backpack slide to the floor. Marcus Kane kept his eyes on the road, one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting on the armrest. He didn't say anything at first, just let the silence settle, thick but comfortable, the kind they'd built over years. Maya stared out the window, watching the sun dip behind strip malls and billboards, her mind still replaying that parking lot standoff. You good? Marcus finally asked, his voice low and steady, like gravel over steel. He didn't look at her, but she felt the weight of his attention. Yeah, she said, exhaling through her nose. Just another day. He glanced at her then, A quick flick of dark eyes and smirked. Just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. That kid looked like he swallowed his tongue when he saw me. Maya let out a small, sharp laugh, resting her head back against the seat. He's all talk. Thinks he runs the place. Marcus nodded, slow and deliberate. Guys like that always do, until they don't. She didn't respond, just let his words hang there, sinking in. Marcus Kane wasn't the type to lecture. He didn't need to. A man who'd clawed his way from a one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta to a tech empire worth billions didn't waste breath on empty lessons. He'd taken Maya in 3 years ago, after her mom's last fresh start had crashed and burned, and he'd never treated her like a charity case. To him, she was family, blood or not, and family meant you figured out how to stand, not lean. They pulled into the driveway of a low-slung house tucked in a quiet suburb. Modern, all sharp lines and glass, but not flashy. Maya grabbed her bag and followed him inside, the hum of the Escalade fading behind them. She dropped onto a kitchen stool, drumming her fingers on the counter as Marcus rummaged through the fridge. You eat yet? He asked, pulling out a carton of orange juice. Not hungry, she said, her mind still on Bryce. His smirk, that tug on her backpack, the way his crew laughed like trained seals. She wasn't scared of him. She dealt with worse. But something about his needling stuck under her skin, like a splinter she couldn't dig out. Marcus poured 2 glasses anyway, sliding one across to her. He's not done with you, he said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. It wasn't a question. Maya met his gaze, her fingers pausing mid-tap. I know. He studied her for a beat, then nodded. So what's your move? She shrugged, wrapping her hands around the cool glass. Same as always. Wait him out. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He knew her well enough to trust she'd handle it her way, and she would. Bryce Carter might think he'd cornered her, but Maya had played this game before. She'd learned patience the hard way, bouncing through schools where kids like him ruled the halls. She didn't fight with fists or tears. She fought with time. Tuesday morning hit like a slap, humid air pressing down as Maya stepped off the bus, the school looming ahead like a brick beast. The parking lot showdown had spread like wildfire overnight, whispers threading through the crowd as she walked in. That's her, someone muttered low and quick. The one with the guy in the Escalade. Heads turned, eyes lingered, but Maya kept her pace steady, her hoodie up, her expression blank. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she hated it. Bryce was waiting by the lockers, same spot as yesterday, his crew sprawled around him like a pack of wolves. He didn't smirk this time, just watched her, arms crossed, his jaw tight. She could feel the heat of his stare as she passed, but she didn't flinch, didn't slow. Let him stew, she thought. He'd make his move soon enough. First period dragged, algebra equations blurring into noise as she sat in the back, doodling in her notebook. By lunch, the tension had thickened. She grabbed a tray, limp fries, and a burger, and headed for a corner table, away from the center where Bryce held court. His crew owned the biggest table, laughing loud, tossing fries like they were kings tossing coins. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked her way, testing her. She ignored him, picking at her food, but she wasn't blind. She saw Ryan, the linebacker from yesterday, nudge Bryce, muttering something that made him nod. Then it happened. She was halfway to her table when Ryan stuck out a foot, casual, deliberate. She stumbled, tray rattling, fries spilling across the floor. Laughter erupted, sharp and jagged, as kids turned to gawk. Maya caught herself before she fell, her pulse spiking, but her face stayed stone. She straightened, set her tray down on the nearest table, and turned to Ryan. Real smooth, she said, voice flat, loud enough to carry. Didn't know cavemen still roam free. A ripple of oohs spread through the room, a few kids snickering. Ryan's grin faltered, his thick neck flushing red. Bryce leaned back in his chair, tilting his head, his eyes narrowing like he was sizing her up anew. You got a mouth, huh? He called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe you should watch it. Maya picked up her tray, meeting his gaze. Maybe you should watch your boys. She walked off, heart pounding but steps steady, and sat alone at her corner table. The room buzzed louder now, whispers chasing her, some amused, some uneasy. Bryce didn't move, but she could feel him plotting. He wasn't used to pushback, especially not from some new girl with no crew, no clout. That made her dangerous, and he didn't like dangerous. By Wednesday, he'd upped the ante. Maya found her locker trashed, books dumped on the floor, a fat black marker scribbled across the metal. Go home, loser. A small crowd lingered nearby, phones out, waiting for her to crack. She didn't. She knelt, stacked her books neat and slow, her hands steady, her face blank. Bryce watched from across the hall, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. She could feel his eyes boring into her, daring her to react. She gave him nothing, just shut her locker with a soft click and walked away. That night, she sat at the kitchen counter, swirling a glass of water as Marcus leaned against the sink, watching her. They hit my locker today, she said finally, her voice low. He raised an eyebrow. That's their big play? For now, she said, smirking faintly. They're not creative. Marcus chuckled, a deep rumble. So what's next? Maya leaned back, her fingers tapping the counter. I let him keep going. He's digging his own hole. Marcus grinned, a flash of teeth. That's my girl. She felt it then, a spark of control, small but growing. Bryce thought he was the hunter, but Maya knew better. She'd seen guys like him before. Big egos, brittle cores. They needed the crowd, the fear, the noise. Take that away and they crumbled. She wasn't going to swing back. She was going to wait, watch, and let him trip over his own feet. Thursday rolled in gray and heavy, clouds pressing low over Houston. The whispers had shifted, less about the Escalade, more about Bryce's stunts. Kids were starting to talk. He's obsessed with her. She doesn't even care. Maya felt the tide turning, subtle but real. Bryce wasn't the king he'd been on Monday. He was still loud, still surrounded, but his grip was slipping. At lunch, he went big. She was walking past his table when he stood, voice booming over the chatter. Hey, Maya, still hiding behind your fancy ride? What, Daddy's money gonna fight for you? The room hushed, forks pausing midair. Maya stopped, turned slow and faced him. Funny, she said, her voice calm, cutting. You're the one who froze when you saw him. Who's hiding now? The cafeteria went dead quiet. Bryce's face darkened, his fists clenching. But she saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. His crew shifted, unsure. A few kids laughed, low and nervous. Maya held his stare a beat longer, then walked off, leaving him standing there exposed. That afternoon, he caught her alone in the back lot. No crowd, no backup. He stepped close, voice low. Why don't you fight back? You scared? Maya looked up at him, unflinching. No, she said, stepping closer, her voice ablade. I just don't need to. You're doing fine tearing yourself down. Bryce stared, his jaw tight, something raw flashing in his eyes. Anger, maybe fear. He didn't have a comeback. For the first time, Maya saw the crack. She turned and left him there, the seed planted. He wasn't invincible, and deep down, he knew it. Friday morning dawned heavy over Houston, the sky a bruised gray that pressed down on Clearview High like a lid on a boiling pot. The air buzzed with something restless, kids shuffling faster through the halls, voices pitching higher, eyes darting. Word had spread about the cafeteria showdown, about Maya's razor-sharp comeback slicing through Bryce's bluster. The king wasn't untouchable anymore, and everyone could feel it. Maya stepped off the bus, her sneakers crunching gravel, her hoodie pulled tight against the damp chill. She didn't miss the glances, some curious, some wary, as she moved through the crowd. The game had shifted, and she was ready to play her hand. Inside, the hallways crackled with energy. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked, and whispers chased her like shadows. She spotted Bryce near his usual post, his crew tighter around him than ever, Ryan hulking at his side, Jake fidgeting with his phone. Bryce didn't look her way this time, but his shoulders were stiff, his jaw set hard. He was a coiled spring, and Maya knew it. She'd planted the doubt yesterday. Now she'd let it fester. She slid into first period, her mind already mapping the day. Watch, wait, strike when the moment broke. Lunch was when it hit. The cafeteria hummed with its usual chaos. Trays clattering, voices overlapping, the sharp tang of ketchup and sweat in the air. Maya grabbed her food, soggy fries, a burger she wouldn't eat, and headed for her corner spot, eyes scanning the room. Bryce's table loomed in the center, his crew sprawled like a war council. She saw him lean over, muttering something to Ryan, then Jake, his gestures sharp. They were planning something, she could smell it. She'd barely sat down when Ryan stood, lumbering toward her with that slow, deliberate swagger. The room didn't quiet, not yet, but heads turned, sensing the shift. He stopped a foot from her table, looming over her, his grin wide and mean. "Hey, new girl," he said, loud enough to draw eyes. "Still think you're hot stuff?" Maya didn't look up, just kept picking at her fries. "Still think you're his lapdog?" Maya set her tray down slow and deliberate, and stood. She was half his size, but her stare hit like a freight train. "Funny," she said, voice steady, carrying over the silence. "You keep saying that, but you're the one who can't let it go." A ripple ran through the room, gasps, low laughs, a few "damns" muttered under breath. Bryce's face tightened, his nostrils flaring. He stepped closer, towering over her, his voice dropping low. "You think you're smart, huh? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Maya didn't blink. "I don't need to talk. You're doing fine screwing yourself." For a second he froze, his crew too, caught off guard by the steel in her tone. Then he laughed, sharp and forced, turning to the room. "Hear that? Little princess here thinks she's running the show." His buddies chuckled, but it was thinner this time, less sure. The crowd wasn't buying it either. Some rolled their eyes, others whispered, phones tilting up to catch the scene. Bryce turned back to her, his smirk twisting into something uglier. "You're nothing," he hissed, low enough that only she heard. "Keep pushing, and I'll bury you." Maya leaned in, voice a whisper. "Try it. See who falls." He held her gaze, fury sparking in his eyes, then spun on his heel, shoving past Ryan to stalk back to his table. The room exhaled, chatter swelling again, but the air felt different, charged, brittle. Maya sat, her pulse steady, her mind racing. She'd pushed him to the edge. Now she just had to wait for him to jump. After school, the halls emptied fast, kids bolting for buses and cars under the gray drizzle. Maya lingered, grabbing books from her locker. Clean now, but the marker stains still ghosted the metal. She felt him before she saw him. Bryce, alone this time, his shadow falling across the tile as he stepped into the hallway. No crew, no audience. Just him. She shut her locker, turning slow, her backpack slung over one shoulder. He stood 10 feet away, hands in his pockets, his varsity jacket damp from the rain. "You think you're winning," he said, voice low, no trace of his usual swagger. "You're not." Maya tilted her head, studying him. Up close, without the noise, he looked smaller, his shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow. "I'm not trying to win," she said. "I'm just not losing." He scoffed, stepping closer. "You don't get it. This is my school, my rules. You don't belong here." She didn't flinch. "Then why are you so scared of me?" His jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. For a second she thought he might swing. His whole body vibrated with it, but he didn't. Instead he leaned in, voice a growl. "You're gonna regret this." Maya smiled, small and cold. "We'll see." He stared at her, something raw flashing in his eyes. Anger, doubt, maybe both. Then turned and stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the empty hall. She watched him go, her heart steady, her mind clear. He was cracking. She could feel it. Monday hit like a thunderclap. The school buzzed before Maya even stepped inside. Kids clustered in knots, voices hushed but urgent, phones out. She felt the shift as she walked through the doors, the air thick with anticipation. Something had happened. She made her way to the main hall, where a crowd had gathered near Bryce's locker, heads craning, murmurs swelling. Then she saw it, taped across the metal door, a stack of printed pages, black ink stark against the red paint. Text messages, screenshots, timestamps glowing fresh. Every ugly word Bryce had ever typed about this school, calling Ryan a dumb ox, Jake a spineless leech, half the football team, losers riding my coattails. Worse stuff, too. Slurs about teachers, kids he smiled at in the halls, venom he'd spewed in late-night group chats. Recent, raw, and real. The crowd parted as Bryce shoved through, his face pale, eyes wide. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice cracking. He ripped the pages down, paper tearing in his hands. But it was too late. Phones were up, pics snapping, whispers turning to laughs. He spun, scanning the faces, then locked onto Maya, leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed. "You!" he hissed, storming toward her, pages crumpling in his fist. "You did this." She didn't move, her voice calm, cutting. "Did I?" His nostrils flared, his whole body shaking. "You think you're so damn clever. This doesn't change anything." Maya stepped forward, close enough to smell the rain on his jacket. "It changes everything, Bryce. You just don't see it yet." He lunged like he might grab her, but a teacher's voice barked from the crowd. "Carter, back off!" And he froze, fist trembling. The hall watched, silent, as his crew melted away. Ryan muttering, Jake staring at the floor. Bryce stood there alone, his kingdom in ashes, and Maya saw it sink in. He'd lost. The twist came later, pieced together in whispers. It wasn't Maya who'd plastered the locker. She'd recorded Bryce's taunts in the cafeteria, slipped her phone out, caught his venom on audio, but she hadn't leaked it. Jake had. The skinny kid with the nervous laugh, the one Bryce had mocked one too many times. Maya had dropped a seed days ago, casual in a group project. "You ever get tired of him treating you like crap?" She'd left her phone on the table, the file unlocked, knowing Jake's eyes would catch it. He'd taken it, stewed on it, and Friday night, after Bryce had humiliated him in front of the team, he'd printed the chats and struck. Maya didn't need to lift a finger. She'd let Bryce's own pack turn on him, let his venom boomerang. By Tuesday, he was gone, suspended, his family pulling him out, the truck missing from the lot. The halls buzzed with it, but Maya walked through, quiet, untouched. That night, she sat at the kitchen counter, swirling ice in her glass as Marcus leaned against the sink, arms crossed. "Heard it's over," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yeah," she said, smirking faintly. "He's done." Marcus studied her, then grinned. "Didn't even break a sweat, huh?" She shrugged, meeting his eyes. "Didn't need to?" He broke himself. He laughed, deep and warm, and slid a glass of juice her way. "That's my girl." The rain had stopped by Wednesday, leaving Houston slick and gleaming under a pale, washed-out sky. Clearview High felt different as Maya stepped off the bus. Quieter somehow, like the air had been wrung out after Monday's storm. The halls still hummed with life, lockers banging, voices overlapping. But the buzz had shifted. No one whispered about Bryce Carter anymore. His locker stood empty, the red paint scrubbed clean of marker and tape, a blank slate where his kingdom had crumbled. Word was his family had yanked him out overnight, shipped him off to some private school across the state. The truck was gone from the lot, his crew scattered. Ryan slinking around solo, Jake keeping his head down. The king was dead, and the school was moving on. Maya walked through the front doors, her sneakers soft against the tile, her hoodie loose over her shoulders. The glances still came, quick, curious, but they weren't the same. No one stared like she was prey now. A few kids nodded as she passed, a faint flicker of respect in their eyes. She didn't smile back, didn't need to. She'd never wanted the spotlight, just the chance to breathe without someone's shadow choking her out. First period was a blur, equations on the board, a teacher droning about midterms. She sat in the back, doodling in her notebook, her mind drifting. She didn't feel triumph, not the way people might expect. Bryce's fall hadn't been about revenge. It had been about survival, carving out a space where she didn't have to flinch every time she turned a corner. She'd done that, and it was enough. Lunch was where it hit her. She grabbed her tray, same soggy fries, same lukewarm burger, and headed for her usual spot, expecting the quiet corner she'd claimed all week. But as she approached, a girl with short curls and a soccer jersey waved her over. "Hey, Maya, Sit with us, she said, scooting to make room. Two other kids, a lanky guy with glasses and a girl with neon streaks in her hair, looked up, nodding like it was no big deal. Maya hesitated, tray hovering, then slid into the seat. Rough week, huh? The guy said, pushing his glasses up with a grin. You're kind of a legend now. Maya smirked, picking at her fries. Not really, just didn't let him win. The girl with the streaks laughed, sharp and bright. That's more than most people around here can say. They talked. Easy stuff. Classes, the football game coming up, and Maya felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. She didn't need to be invisible anymore. She didn't need to be the toughest either. She could just be here, now, with people who didn't care about her past or her scars. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was better. After school, she walked to the curb, the sun dipping low, painting the lot in golden shadow. The black Escalade rolled up, right on time, its engine a low growl that still turned a few heads. Maya yanked the door open and slid inside, dropping her backpack with a thud. Marcus Kane sat behind the wheel, his broad frame filling the space, one hand resting on the gearshift. He didn't say anything at first, just let her settle, the silence familiar and warm. It's done, huh? He said finally, his voice a deep rumble, eyes on the road as he pulled out. Yeah, Maya said, leaning back, her fingers drumming lightly on her knee. He's gone. Marcus glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You didn't even have to throw a punch. She snorted, a small laugh slipping out. Didn't need to. He threw himself off the cliff. He chuckled, the sound filling the car, rich and low. Smartest kid I know. They drove in quiet for a bit, the city sliding past, strip malls, gas stations, the occasional palm tree swaying in the breeze. Maya let her gaze drift out the window, the weight of the week peeling off her like old paint. She'd walked into Clearview expecting a fight, braced for it, like always. But this time, she'd won without bleeding. That felt new. Marcus broke the silence, his tone softer. You okay with how it went down? She thought about it, rolling the question over in her mind. Jake's betrayal, Bryce's rage, the way the school had turned on him like a tide. Yeah, she said finally. He dug his own grave. I just handed him the shovel. Marcus nodded, his smirk widening into a grin. That's my girl. She met his eyes, a flicker of pride sparking in her chest. Marcus hadn't swooped in to save her, hadn't needed to. He'd raised her to stand, not lean, and she had. But she knew he'd been there, a quiet wall at her back, ready if she'd faltered. That was enough. The rest of the week unfolded slow and steady. The whispers faded, replaced by the usual hum of high school, homework, gossip, the countdown to Friday's game. Maya fell into a rhythm. Classes, lunch with the new crew, the occasional nod from kids she didn't know. She wasn't the center of anything, didn't want to be, but she wasn't an outsider either. For the first time in years, she felt the ground under her feet, not shifting, not cracking, just solid. Friday night, she sat on the bleachers, the air crisp with fall and the roar of the crowd swelling around her. The football team took the field, Ryan out there, lumbering but subdued, Bryce's absence a ghost on the sidelines. Her new friends cheered beside her, the girl with streaks yelling loudest, and Maya let herself grin. Just a little. She didn't care about the score, didn't need the noise. She was here, part of it, and that was more than she'd expected when she'd stepped off that bus. Later, driving home, Marcus turned the radio low, some old R&B track humming through the speakers. Enjoying it yet? He asked, one eyebrow raised. Maya leaned her head against the window, the glass cool on her skin. Yeah, she said, a real smile tugging at her lips. Think I might. He laughed soft and warm and cranked the volume up. The Escalade rolled through the night, Houston's lights blurring past, and Maya felt it, a lightness she hadn't known she'd been chasing. She'd come to Clearview expecting a war, but she'd found something else, a place to stand, a chance to breathe. Bryce Carter was a memory now, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls, a king who'd built his throne on sand, only to watch it wash away. Maya didn't gloat, didn't need to. She'd seen him for what he was, a kid so scared of falling, He'd pushed everyone else down to stay up. When Jake turned, when the truth spilled, he'd had no one left to catch him. That wasn't her victory, it was his failure. Hers was quieter, deeper. She'd walked through the fire without burning, and she'd come out whole. The story didn't end with a bang. It ended with Maya on those bleachers, the crowd roaring, her friends laughing, the night stretching wide ahead. She'd won, not by being louder or meaner, but by being steady, by letting the truth do the heavy lifting. And as the Escalade's headlights cut through the dark, she knew one thing for sure. The quiet ones were the ones you didn't see coming. They were the ones who lasted.